Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Does the who are we include all the people who originally founded Sustain? I feel like it should. I feel like it should. In that case, all of us. Moving on. Really excited to talk to our guest slash host today. It's going to be really, really cool to have him on again. You have heard this voice before. Just so you know who the other voices are on this podcast, I want to let you know that I'm not the only host today, which is always very exciting. I get to see my friends. I am, of course, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. And I'm joined today by the illustrious Abigail Cabunoc Mays. Abby, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm joined with a baby, so we'll see how well this podcast goes.
What's your baby's name?
Rose.
Rose is also a co-host today. We'll set her up on the website, sustainoss.org/podcast. And Leslie Hawthorne, how you doing?
Very well, thank you, sir.
Very good. Glad that you are doing well. And Justin Dorfman, how are you?
I'm doing great. Really
I saw
happy
your dog
to
in
be
the
here.
background. What's your dog's name?
Petey is here. He's on the mic.
Petey is here as well. Also going to get a co-host account. So that's very great. So we have so many people on. And also, I'm glad you're here. Sorry for talking over you. I need to learn how to not do that as a host. That's one of my main jobs. I'm not going to talk over this guest because this guest is amazing. Chad Whitacre. Chad, how are you doing today?
Hi, Richard. I'm doing great.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad to have you on. Literally every single time I see your face, I just get so happy. Chad co-founded Sustain OSS way back in the antediluvian eras of 2017. He was one of the predecessors to the Sustain podcast, which was the conference. He's not a predecessor, but he helped found it. And he also founded GitTip, which was later Gratipay, and a pioneering open source platform. Radical openness was involved. Currently head of open source at Sentry, which is an application monitoring company, if you're not familiar, where he runs the industry-leading programs on community engagement, compliance, and funding that he does, which is super cool. Basically runs the OSPO there. He also does some other really cool things. Justin, I see your hands up. You got something to say?
In October of 2021, we had Chad on the podcast. Topics to discuss. Sentry's 150K open source funding initiative. And then the BSL.
Oh, wow.
What has changed, Chad, since then?
Oh, goodness. So that time I was on the show, it was right after we had just given away $150,000 to open source projects at Sentry. So maybe a little setup. I joined Sentry a year before that, so 3 years ago. So longtime user of Sentry and joined 3 years ago, as an IC engineer actually on the open source team, and then got really a proper OSPO started right around that time you're talking about, Justin. And one of the first big things we did as an OSPO is we made this major, for us, donation to the open source projects that we depend on in the community. So Sentry, started life in 2008 as a tiny little open source side project and grew for years just as a community side project, non-commercial. Commercialized starting in 2012, really in 2015 is when David and Chris, the two founders, took venture capital, started growing as a startup. So many years, just, it's this open source side project, deep roots in the open source community. And David and Chris have always given back to open source projects, financially, specifically, I'm talking about. So when I showed up a couple years ago, it was at this interesting inflection point. The company was, I think it was like number 130 at the company. So starting to grow a little bit. Along with growth comes kind of the need to formalize some things, get organized. And so kind of the giving that David had done all along, David and Chris, and the giving that Sentry had done, it was time to get that organized. So that's what you're referring to there, Justin. That 150K was this kind of systematic, well-organized, let's give money to open source in kind of a systematic, sustainable way. Let's run it as an annual program. Shout out to Dwayne and Indeed for their part in the story. But yeah, so your question is what's happened since then? So since then, we've run that funding program 2 more times. So 150K that first year. The second year we came back and we did 260K. And then this past year, this past month. So this year, about a month ago, we shipped the third iteration of that annual open source funding program. And we did 500K this year, which is, it's interesting because you got to look at per capita, right? Sentry now has about 350 employees. I think I counted 135 engineers. So we kind of look at the number of engineers we've got in the company. We say, what's the value that our engineering team gets from the open source ecosystem? Kind of the non-commercial, we can talk about this too, because open source is not monolithic. The open source community is not monolithic. It's got different parts to it. And so we're particularly focused kind of on the non-commercial, sponsorable part of the open source community. So what's the value that we as a company get from that part of the community? If you work it out, 135 engineers, $500K, that's $3,700 per engineer at Sentry per year that we're giving to open source now. Yeah, so that's the number we think in terms of. So I guess rambling answer to your question, Justin, we've done that funding program 2 more times, grown it each time. And then you also brought up the license too.
Wait. I
Where
want
do
to
you go
interject
next?
right there.
Yep.
This sounds like napkin math. How did you come up with this?
It was actually right in the era when Sustain started, spring, summer of 2017. I was winding down GradaPay. We were launching Sustain as a conference at the time. And I was kind of doing some thinking about this question of open source sustainability. There's a lot of kind of energy and enthusiasm around it. And in some cases, kind of like negative energy, like why aren't companies giving more? Like there's this sense almost of unfairness, right? That it's like, here's all these companies that are using all this open source software that all of these kind of, wow. I mean, I'm talking about myself. These idealistic youths are just spending all their, energy building all this great software, putting it out into the world, and then waking up 10 years later, totally burned out because they've poured themselves out, myself out, writing all this open source software, and then realize, like there's an economic reality to life, and there's all these companies that are using our stuff and aren't giving back. And, that's actually kind of built into open source licensing, which we'll get to, is that, there isn't a need to give back financially. So, that's, we'll get to that. Okay. Right. So 2017, was winding down GradaPay. We were launching Sustain. And I was kind of thinking about, I was trying to step back, it was kind of a moment of pause for me to kind of reflect and say, what's really the goal here? Like, let's get a little more nuance about the shape of this problem, and let's really identify what it is we're going after. And like, what would it take to kind of check the box and say done? Like this feeling of kind of unfairness or resentment that exists. Like, what would it actually take to kind of resolve that tension in our industry and in the community? And so that's where you get to, the napkin math that you're alluding to, Justin. So I kind of did some napkin math, came up with this figure, and we could dig up the blog post. They're on the old GradaPay.blog. You got them, GradaPay.news, right? Yeah, okay, you got them on the side there. Yeah, right. So tried to do this first principles reasoning about what's kind of the rough size of the economic value that the open source, the sponsorable, non-commercial part of the open source community is creating. And then what, so start, top down and then work bottom up. And now what is our company's kind of share in that, or what would be an amount that we would give that we would feel like, okay, we've done our part. We have fairly treated this part of the open source community. Yeah. Does that get at what you're asking about, Justin?
Well, yeah. But adjusted for inflation is $2,000 per person is that what Sentry is doing?
That's what okay. So yeah, that was the napkin math in 2017. That's where Sentry started 2 years ago with the 150K. We actually just, it's in 75 devs times 2 is 150 and came up with that budget. It's a little looser than that this time. That's 3,700. 2017 to now, the market, I don't think we're at that much inflation. So yeah, we're beating inflation on that one, I guess. I haven't checked, but yeah, so it's a little looser than that. We're still kind of wrestling internally, and ideally this would be a bigger conversation, right? I think part of what, going back to your earlier question about what has changed, we're at the point where like we need other companies to join us. Like I've run this program 3 years in a row at Sentry. We're kind of pushing the limits of the tooling that's available. We can talk about Thanks Dev and GitHub sponsors and some of these other platforms. Like we're really straining like the limits of the tooling that's available. Like we need other companies to come along. And there are others, right, that are doing this, that are giving money back to we also need a better name for this, right? The non-commercial sponsorable part of the open source community. But that's definitely something that's changed the past couple of years. Like we've reached this point where it's like, all right, like this isn't like a new kind of gimmick anymore, right? This is like, let's make this real. Let's make this repeatable. Let's make this sustainable. Let's make this, blow it up and have hundreds and thousands. Like it, this is going to be a mantra. it needs to be weird for companies not to do what Sentry's doing, right? It needs to be weird for companies not to significantly sponsor these projects. So yeah, when we talk about what's that right amount, we think that the per capita, the per dev figure is an interesting one to talk about because that's easier. Because the other big one is revenue. Like you can talk about percentage of revenue or percentage, profit or something like this. That one gets dicier when you're like, well, you got public companies, sure, but you got a lot of private companies. Are they going to be comfortable talking about that? And it seems like some kind of metric that's roughly, it's never be perfect, but roughly comparable across the industry is a helpful thing to get to. So the kind of the per dev number seems to be a good one to dial in on. So is 2,000 the right number? Is 3,700 the right number? Let's make that a conversation, but I think that's a conversation worth having.
This is really, really cool. I have some really silly questions, which may seem a bit out of base for a second. How many employees does Sentry have?
We're at about 350 right now.
350 employees. Great.
Yeah. And 135 engineers.
Are they mostly in the States?
Yes, on a technicality. So our headquarters is San Francisco, and we're not a remote company. We're an in-office company. I'm an exception that I'm remote. But our main office is in San Francisco. Our second-tier offices are two. We have one in Toronto and one in Vienna. And then we have tertiary offices in Seattle, which is where my team, the OSPO, is. And I think Amsterdam. I think we might have a tiny office in Amsterdam.
So generally in the large Western industrialized world. So
correct.
Excellent. Okay. Do you pay all of your employees a living wage?
That one's an easy answer. Yes.
Great. Awesome. Okay. That's excellent. What I'm trying to dial in is I'm trying to answer the question for myself of, are open source practitioners who have licensed their software in a way that gives it away for free the best segment of the world population that Sentry is making money off of to give money back to? Or perhaps should the global south be considered? Should your contractors be considered? Why are you focusing on open source except that you're in that seat?
Well, I mean, we can get contractors out of the way. We do have contractors and we pay them.
Cool. Okay, great.
The founders of our company are David Kramer and Chris Jennings. They come from the open source world. And, we still very much think of ourselves as a company as, this is delicate, as an open source company, as an open source aligned company. There's this pledge 1% corporate giving movement. And the conversations we have internally are, well, if we're going to do this pledge 1%, giving to open source is part of that. So, on the one hand, we definitely think of that as like something that's core to our DNA. It's a core part of Sentry's company culture. After this call, I've got an onboarding session. Every employee that joins Sentry goes through an open source onboarding session where I walk them through what open source means to us in general, to us, to our company, and the programs we run around open source and how it impacts their role at the company. So open source is core to our company culture. And also because we've been there, meaning folks at this company have poured a lot into open source and seen the sustainability challenges. And so, we consider ourselves part of this larger open source community where there is this hole, there is this gap, there is this need, there is this imbalance. Yeah. So it's kind of taking care of our own in a sense. How does that intersect with, Western versus global South? I'm going to be honest, that's not a huge topic of conversation inside the company. We love seeing the open source conferences that are getting going in the continent of Africa and different places, right? Like there's definitely, a lot of momentum in India, right? There's a lot of stuff happening.
I'm not trying to nail it to the wall.
Okay.
What I'm really curious about is that open source is a serious issue. We know it's a serious issue. I've been there too. You've been there. Supporting developers is really important. But whenever you talk about we should have other companies also giving back to open source, the first question that the bottom line is gonna ask is why this segment versus some other segment that's philanthropically focused? Why
segment of open source?
Yeah, like why are you giving back to developers who've already given away tools that you can just take?
Okay, so here's maybe a distinction to make. When we think about giving money to open source, it's precisely that, it's giving back. So a conversation I have internally, and there's, this is like, I'm representing my own opinion here, and this is like a topic of debate internally.
Cool.
I think that this line item should be software, not charity. In other words, like we pay for SaaS, right? We pay for this SaaS and this SaaS and this SaaS. And in our accounting and our books, that's how it's reported. And then we also do, because we do other philanthropic giving besides open source. We have a whole like charitable matching, and we do some other stuff besides open source. Okay. And, that gets counted for as charity. And so this program that I run for open source funding, I think it's this interesting conversation, right? How do you account for it? Because I see it as, usually in non-charitable things, which is most of what a company's budget is, you talk about ROI. What's the return on the investment? So I'm paying for this thing. What am I getting in return for my payment? Okay. And I think that what the non-commercial sponsorable segment of the open source community has done is created this opportunity to talk about IOR, invest on return. And the point of that is just to flip it around, to say, usually we think about, okay, I'm procuring this software, I'm procuring this product from this vendor, and I go through this whole procurement process, and then I give them the money, we sign the contract, I give them the money, and then I get access to the thing, right? Whereas with open source, the point is there's still a value exchange, right? There's a value exchange, which makes it different than kind of the more purely philanthropic things that I think you might be pointing to, Richard, because there's a value exchange here. It's like we get tons of value from this open source software. It's like, and so when I think about, all right, we're going to give $500,000 to these open source maintainers, I'm not thinking about what are the strings attached that I'm like looking for in the future. Like I'm giving this money and I'm going to follow up 6 months later and see, did they fix these bugs? Did they put out these releases? I'm not thinking about it that way. I'm thinking about, I'm giving $500,000 to this. We're going to find the term for it. But until then, the sponsораbles, what's a good term for this? Non-commercial sponsorable part of the open source community. We got value from them this whole past year, and I'm paying for the value that I got this past year from these software developers. That's what I think about it. So maybe we're getting at with this line of thinking is like, we're not thinking about it as like purely charitable. It doesn't fit in that same corporate philanthropy bucket in the same way. And that's why, we go on to say, hey, rest of the industry, like you're also getting this value. This gets back to the commons. This gets back to how you provision a commons. You either, public goods are provisioned in two ways, taxes or shame, essentially, right? Like, it's either taxation, and there's interesting stuff going on. Sovereign tech fund's the big one. It's a sovereign tech fund in Germany. They gave 15 million euro this past year to open source projects, digital infrastructure. So focused on a particular segment, really that infrastructure layer stuff. And it's great. And it's funded by the German government. That's awesome. So taxes are one way and are honestly kind of the main way that we provision public goods, roads and bridges, right? And then the other way that we provision commons is through, it's basically quasi-governmental organizations where you're self-organized and you do a good enough job that the government, the main government leaves you alone and you kind of police each other. It ends up coming down to, you don't quite get a gun like you get with the state, but you get some kind of meaningful repercussions. And it essentially amounts to, yes, shame or validation. So I think about corporate social validation as the leverage point that certainly at Sentry we're trying to work with, because, again, that's where I sit at Sentry. I'm not, I'm not a sovereign tech fund, for example.
Chad, I was wondering if you could comment on the overall divestment we've seen from corporations into open source over the past year and any impacts you've seen on the overall open source maintainer ecosystem as a result of that. And in particular, I spent a lot of time thinking about the shrinking of OSPOs because these organizations are the ones who are there as sort of the stewarding function for large corps to understand how they're going to contribute to ensuring that there's consistent value in the overall ecosystem. And I tend to think more about the human element in development, but also accompanying that, as we've seen OSPO shrinks, there's been a corresponding shrink in budgets for supporting open source overall in a wide variety of ways. And I'm just wondering if you've, what are your thoughts on that, especially as you're saying, and I agree with you, it should be weird for companies not to be sponsoring open source. Yeah.
I mean, certainly I've seen this, a shrinking of investment in OSPOs. A couple places to go with this. One is that, of course, OSPOs do a lot more than just funding open source, this kind of sponsorable part of the open source ecosystem. There's a lot of managing a company's own open source output. There's a lot of licensing and compliance, of course, is a huge part. So, and each OSPO is different. Again, Sentry, open source is so core to our company culture. We've got, I only have 2 people on my team. There's 3 of us. We're a tiny team. But again, every person that comes in has, in their first 30 days, usually it's the first week or two, an open source onboarding session. It's very core to our company. So we think about, our OSPO's scope is, in some ways bigger, in some ways just different than at a lot of companies. Actually, somebody was asking about this earlier. I haven't seen, and maybe you've seen this, and I'd be interested to see it. Like, do we have great data on kind of the overall funding of the open source ecosystem? Like, do we have a chart that shows a line that's gone down the past couple of years? I've done kind of some one-off spot analysis, and going back to the napkin math 5 years ago of like what's the size of the ecosystem. Do we have great data on that? That'd definitely be something to. I know there's the FOSS Foundations from Shane Kirkuru, I believe it is, that would be maybe a good place for that. I guess I feel like the fact that Sentry is so weird, the fact that we don't have this kind of culture of companies paying, like one of the symptoms of that is like we don't have great visibility. Yeah, I couldn't really tell you what we as an industry were giving 3 years ago and what we're giving today. Yeah, so maybe there's a place to share this. We had some shenanigans last month when we announced our giving program for the year. We use GitHub sponsors for this. And one of the things I set out to do was to give to every project on GitHub, because GitHub gives you this little dial. When you log into sponsors and you go to explore, you get this little dial that says you're giving to X% of your dependencies. And I said, okay, I can play this game. I want to give $3, $4, $5 a month to every single one of my I want to get this to 100%, right? Like what do you want to do with the dial? You want to max it out, right? So I did. So we got to 95, averaged like 98%, because we have 3 orgs on GitHub. So I got it there. It was like 98, 99%. Couldn't quite get to 100 for, some edge cases, but yeah, basically got there, like pushing, upper 90s. And it was so fun. And I put it out on, sorry, Richard, I did put it out on X. And with these screenshot, this was so bad, because I put that one out with the dials all at 98%. But then I also, this was so bad. I took a screenshot of Sentry is supporting 500 plus dependencies. GitHub is supporting 7 dependencies. Microsoft is supporting 3 dependencies. And I put the screenshot out there and I said, I don't make the rules.
You should
I'm
not
sorry.
feel bad about that.
Mouse
That's
face.
awesome.
Well, and I was with the GitHub sponsors team a week or two ago and connected with some Microsoft friends as well. And yeah, and like, this is part of what I mean about that corporate social validation is like, we need to start telling stories about the companies that are doing it, and yeah, some light ribbing, about companies that maybe could be doing better. It's like, yeah. So like, I'm looking for, like, the sponsors folks are getting the message, like they're working, my message to them was like, make the easy button for yourselves, like look at all the work Sentry has to go to. Like it took so much effort to get to that 5, like to actually sponsor everybody was really hard. It took a lot of manual scripting and API work. Shout out to the Thanks Dev crew for helping with that. But yeah, like we need that easy button. GitHub isn't the place to do it. Obviously others are working on this as well. But I don't know, Leslie, I feel like I'm dodging your question a little bit, but like, I feel like it's always been so bad that it's kind of lost in the noise, like of the divestment of the past couple of years or whatever, a year or two. Our giving to open source as an industry was never good enough that we would notice that as a particular hit when things are contracting.
That's real. It's bleak, but it's real.
Yeah. Can I plug FOSS Funders? FOSSfunders.com. Thank you. FOSSfunders.com was started by Dwayne O'Brien while he was at Indeed. And it's been going, I joined like a couple years ago, and I think it had been going for maybe a few months when I joined. So actually, Justin, it was probably around the time when we spoke last time. You said October 21. And it's a working group. So it's a call every 2 weeks for folks that are decision makers at companies that give to open source. It's specifically focused on financial giving to open source projects. Again, OSPOs do a lot of stuff closely related to funding, but we wanted to particularly focus on this problem. Yeah, so it's a working group of folks in the industry, decision makers at companies. So we've been doing that call for a couple of years, sharing best practices and sharing about each other's programs and getting to know one another and so forth. And we have a Slack on to-do group, get plugged in there. In August of this year, so a few months ago, I actually did it during Sentry's Hack Week. we have a hack week at Sentry, like a number of companies do. I said, you know what I'm going to do? And I fired up Midjourney and I made a new banner image, and I made a new website for FOSS funders. We had a website, we had kind of an initial website, but I kind of spruced up the website in August, and then started recruiting other companies to add their logo to that website. What does that mean? That means our company has a story about supporting open source financially, and we want to tell that story. So if you go to fossfunders.com, you'll see, I think we're at 10 right now. There's 10 logos on there. So we've got Front-End Masters, Indeed, Microsoft, Prisma, Pydantic, Sentry, SourceGraph, Spotify, Tarsnap, and Vercel are on there. And each one of those links out. Justin, I think SourceGraph links to a wiki or some documentation about your funding efforts. But each one of those links to a company resource where they're sharing in their own words, here's how we think about funding open source, and here's kind of our story around open source funding. So the goal of FOSS funders is to build this, again, corporate social validation, right? The kind of positive reinforcement for companies that do pay attention to this, that do step up and do their part. Yeah. So if your company does have a story to tell about giving to open source, even if you feel like it's small, like everything matters at this point. Really, the goal at this point is like, let's get 100 logos on there, right? And not worry too much about kind of the maturity of this program versus that program. But if your company does anything, once a year gives $10,000 to a project, put up a blog post where you tell that story in your own voice, and let's get that linked, and let's amplify these stories about companies that are stepping up and are doing right by the sponsораbles. Maybe that's the term we can come to.
Does my single person LLC count? That's just me.
Heck yeah, dude.
Cool.
That blog post.
All right.
I don't think
We are
Tarsnap
coming.
Does Colin employ that many people at Tarsnap? I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. So that's what FOSS Funders is about. And it's great. Like I said, August, September, October, November. So let's say 3 months in, and we've got 10 companies, 10 logos on there, including, come on, Microsoft's on there, right? Spotify. That's great. Anyway, we're having fun.
That's awesome. How does someone join FOSS funders if they want to get their logo there?
It's a PR on GitHub. Happy to help with it. Again, we've got this Slack, so you'll find that information on there. You can join our Slack channel. I am still pretty active on X, Twitter, so reach out to me there. And actually, I set up an account for FOSS funders too, so doing some shenanigans there with the FOSS funders account. Yeah, the time will come, like phase 2 is like once we've got 100 logos on there, then maybe we can start talking more about kind of the maturity of this program versus that program, and so the best practices, and highlight some of that. Yeah, but for now we're in that, like, let's just, kind of gather the coals together is how I think of it. It's kind of, we've got little people like Front-End Masters, for example. Front-End Masters has been giving, per capita more than Sentry for years. Mark from Front-End Masters made the jQuery date time picker 15 years ago or whatever. And this thing is like, embedded in WordPress and is on, half the websites in the world. And this was his own story of really investing a lot in open source and then getting burned out. And he found kind of sustainability through Front-End Masters, in the education component. Yeah, but they've been giving a lot. And we got engaged on Twitter a couple months ago. And he was sort of like, well, yeah, I give to open source. Of course I do. But like, nobody cares, right? I don't get any value out of it. Nobody wants to hear about it. It's like, yeah, people want to hear about it, right? Like, you're doing great. Like, that can be a huge encouragement to others at their company to realize like this is a good thing to do, and that you are going to be kind of in good company if your company's doing it as well. Yeah, FOSS funders is my big plug this time around. That's what's different from last time, Justin. This time we've got FOSS funders.
Nice. I do have a bit of a subject change, if that's okay.
Fine with me. Yeah.
I was thinking about how we met Chad, and I found this Instagram video I posted. I don't know if the reflections are.
Oh, you've got it. Do you remember where that is? Where
it's tagged at the Austin Convention Center, so probably in Austin.
Yeah.
At some point.
Can you describe it for our listeners, Abby?
Oh, that's right. Not everyone's watching the YouTube. The caption is, Chad has the best business cards. Oh, this is a Community Leadership Summit 2017.
Yeah, with Jono, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. And there's Chad with his name tag, and he's just pressing down on this big lever on top of a little coin, and then it puts a little heart in the coin.
Yeah, it's a Roper Whitney number 8 metal punch. And I got for the YouTube. All right, now I'll bring out the the show and tell. Here's the tooling. Here's the punch and die with the Get Tip Heart, Gratipay Heart logo. So what's fun about this is I got this made, and they see the shape of that heart, how it's like rounded at the top. It's not like a point like you'd usually get. That was because the folks that were making this were like, we can't get that point in the top. It was like a limitation of the machining of this tooling. And so I ended up changing Get Tip's logo to match what they were able to put in the metal. So that, it's kind of the physical bleeding back into the digital. But yeah, we had a lot of fun punching these pennies.
How many of these pennies do you think are out in the
goodness, thousands. Yeah. I mean, because it was a few years. Well, because what the fun thing is, like, you bring it out, because again, it was 35 pounds. Yeah, but you pull it out. Well, first of all, I had this case made for it, and I put wheels on the bottom. So I'm like dragging this case around. So usually it'd be like, go to a conference. I've got this weird case I'm dragging around behind me for a day. And then after a day of people seeing me drag around, they're like, what is that? What do you carry? And I'm like, oh, that's my business card. And they're like, your business card? What does that mean? I'm like, well, you want to see it? And then you pull it out, you plunk this, like you go over to like Docker's booth or whatever and be like, can I use your table? And then you like plunk this giant 35-pound metal punch on their table, and you pull out the pennies, and then, you kind of coach, like you said, Abby, you coach somebody through punching their own penny. Yeah. And then it's like, here's your business card. But then what happens is everybody else sees this, and then you often get a line, and then it's like, all right, now you're just punching pennies for the next hour or two or whatever.
If someone submitted the logo to FOSS Funders and then emailed you, would you mail them a penny?
I have to say yes, don't I? Come on, Richard. I can't say no to that. I can't say no to that. Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
If you come to me and you mention that you learned about FOSS Funders from this show, and we get your company logo on there, we'll do it in the GitHub pull request. We'll document it for everybody to see and get the link back to Sustain, and then we'll punch some pennies. So here's what a penny looks like. Right?
And I think that's a great place to wrap up. I don't want to ask any more very tough questions of Chad. Chad, thank you so much. Where can people learn more about your efforts? I know you said you're on X. Do you have like a blog or anything like that?
Well, chadwhitaker.com is a kind of a one-pager homepage. You can get links from there. I think we'll link out in the show notes to Sentry's blog post about our most recent funding initiative, obviously FOSS Funders. We didn't even get to the license yet, FSL.software. Maybe if I can kind of mention this briefly, we do think about licensing and funding as going hand in hand, because like we were talking about earlier, open source licensing kind of has this tragedy of the commons, this tendency built into it, kind of by design almost. We need to be honest about that and then have that conversation about licensing in the open source community and how that relates to sustainability and funding. But that's a big, difficult conversation. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. I want to briefly mention
that's okay. We don't have to cover every single rabbit hole. We can also, you can go do that on forums. You can do that online. There's a lot to talk about. Yep. This is our 200th podcast-ish. We've recorded over 250 in the whole Sustain thing. So your little Let's Start a Sustain conference is still going. And that's all thanks partially to you. So thank you so much. You're the best.
I could use my spotlight for this, but I appreciate you for everything that you do to keep this party going. This is awesome. I love seeing Sustain keep on rolling through the years. Like you said, over 200 podcasts. That's awesome, man. Who knew, Justin, when we were first organizing that Sustain conference, that this would be what we're still doing, but it's awesome.
Thumbs up from Justin. Thank you. I appreciate that. That segues really well into Spotlight. Spotlight's part of the show where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we feel like just need some light shed on them. I have to really enunciate the shed or it sounds really bad. So, excellent. Spotlight. I normally go first. I'm going to spotlight. I don't know if I've done this before. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Really, really like that book. Reading it at the moment, finishing it up. And it's just an excellent, excellent book. I actually find it very rewarding and it makes me happy reading about how he survived the Holocaust. I know normally that's not what people say when you suggest a Holocaust book, but for me, it makes me feel like the world's a better place than I imagined it could be. So highly suggest Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. If I've done that again, that's okay. It's a really good book. Leslie, what is your spotlight today?
My spotlight was actually mentioned earlier by Chad on the show, the Sovereign Tech Fund. Wanted to give them a shout out for being an excellent funding body supporting open source projects, celebrate that they've now become an independent entity so they can grow their organization, and personally thank them for their support of the Yocto project. Some of my nearest and dearest friends are affiliated with the Yocto community. So thank you, Sovereign Tech Fund. You folks are amazing.
Whoop, whoop. Abby?
Oh, we got a crying baby. So I am on mat leave. My spotlight's actually, I listened to all of the Wheel of Time audiobooks. It's like 30 days worth of content.
I'm literally screaming with joy. Yes, that's amazing. I had to go off mute for that. Wheel of Time is the best. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I plowed through that. She's 3 months old now, and I started around when she was born.
Amazing. Sorry for yelling. I've never yelled on the camera before. I really freaking love Wheel of Time. It's really good for just mindless reading that you don't need to pay attention to. Justin's headphones are dead, and he said he didn't have one, and I wholly just forgot. Justin wants to highlight the great city of LA. If you haven't been there, Justin really, really loves it. So you should go check it out sometime. Chad, what's yours?
Yeah, I wanted to give the shout out to, and commemorate Bram Molinar, who passed away. That's something that changed Justin since last time I was here. I'm a Vim user. I've been a Vim user for a long time. Always a new Vim user. Never, always more to learn. Amazing piece of software, amazing piece of open source software. When I was reflecting on what's an open source piece of software that has really shaped my open source experience, the editor, Vim. So rest in peace, memory eternal, Bram Molinar.
Chad, I appreciate you coming on this podcast. Listeners and watchers, I appreciate that you also came on. For those of you who are confused, wait, they do YouTube? Don't worry, this is like our second one. We're just trying this out. Yes, you can watch this online. How do I find a link to that? Well, you can go to our podcast at sustainoss.org website where you can see the podcast. You can also go to our YouTube channel, Sustain OSS, where this will be linked at some point. We're working on that. We also have a website, of course, sustainoss.org. We also have a Discourse, sustainoss.org, where you want to talk about things that's really cool. You can come talk about them there. We're also on Mastodon. We're on Blue Sky. We stopped using the Fast Network, formerly known as X, which is excellent. I'm really happy to be able to say that. And besides that, we are also taking donations. So after having just made a very political statement, I guess I'm asking for money. So that's great. It'd be really cool if you supported this podcast, because one of our Open Collective accounts, we have two of them, recently ran out of money, which is great. We use the money. That's excellent. But the money will run out. So if you like this podcast, you should donate to it. And you can do that on Open Collective at podcast Sustain OSS or something. Just Google Sustain. It's in there. And that's really, really cool. Also, like this podcast and share it with your friends. Share it with your enemies. Share it with the local trees and stones. It'd be really, really cool. It doesn't really exist unless other people listen to it. So that's really great. And again, Chad, thank you so much for coming on. I'm so glad that you're able to donate money. I'm so glad you're still out there defending things. Sorry for the hard questions. You're amazing. Keep up the good work. And thanks again.
I'm here for it. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be with you all. Thank you.